Observable notebooks are powered by JavaScript, but we've made some small changes to the language to enable reactive data flow. So let's dig into some of the surprises that you might run into if you're used to writing vanilla JavaScript. If you've never written JavaScript before, you might want to study some basics first. Check out the introductory guides on Mozilla Developer Network, they're great. Or take an Intro to JS course on your favorite online learning platform. If you already know Python, check out our notebook on JavaScript for Python programmers. Every cell in an observable notebook is a piece of JavaScript code. A cell might contain a simple value like a number or a string, maybe a data structure like an array or an object. And note that I need to wrap an object in parentheses. We'll learn why that is a little bit later. A cell could also contain a more complex expression, maybe some arithmetic that evaluates to a number, or maybe a logical operation that evaluates to a Boolean, or perhaps a function, which I can call elsewhere in the notebook. A cell could even contain a promise. Observable will automatically wait for it to resolve. I don't need a wait or then, even in references to it. Observable will manage that for me even when the value changes. Unlike some other notebook environments, Observable doesn't have different cell types for things like Markdown or HTML. It's always JavaScript. Even when I write Markdown or HTML content in Observable, I'm still writing JavaScript. The string in these backticks is a JavaScript template literal tagged by the built-in MD function that comes with Observable. Watch our video on reactive Markdown and HTML to learn more about what you can do with those built-in tags. As we can see in this language cell, I can name a cell by typing a name and an equal sign to the left of whatever expression my cell contains. Now, this looks a lot like a variable assignment in JavaScript, but notice that there's no let or const in front of the name here. And in fact, if I try to add it, Observable will throw a syntax error. That's because what's to the left of the equal sign here isn't actually JavaScript. To the right of the equal sign, I'm writing JavaScript, but to the left, I'm writing Observable, not JavaScript. When I'm naming a cell like this, I'm actually declaring an observable cell value, not a JavaScript variable. Observable makes that value available to the rest of my notebook as if it were a JavaScript variable. But Observable is also doing some fancy work under the hood to make sure that that variable and any cells referencing it reactively update anytime the cell's value changes. Check out our video on reactive data flow to learn more about how those reactive updates work. That type of let declaration that I'm used to from vanilla JavaScript doesn't work in observable cells because this is not an expression that reduces to a value. Rather, it's an imperative statement performing an action, in this case, declaring a mutable variable. In Observable, generally each cell should contain a single expression, like each number, string, or data structure that we saw above. But sometimes I really do want to write a chunk of imperative code, like maybe declare some variables, and then use them in a for loop. Now, this is valid JavaScript. It works in my browser console, for example. But in an observable cell, it doesn't work. To get it to work, I have to first wrap this entire script in curly braces. Okay, now the error has gone away, great, but I still don't have the value I want. I just have undefined instead of my string. What I need to do is explicitly return the value that I want out of those curly braces. Aha, okay, now I've got what I want, a code block that outputs a single value, in this case, a string. And it's important to remember that just like with any curly brace block in JavaScript, any variables I declare within a cell are local to that cell. So if I try to access A in another cell, it won't work. Only the returned value is available to the rest of the notebook if I give the cell a name. Now, since these curly braces are also used to represent objects in JavaScript, that's why I needed parentheses around my object in a cell earlier, so that Observable doesn't confuse the curly braces for a code block like this one. Now, hold it. Why do I have to wrap a script like this in curly braces and return a value? Well, I find it really useful to think of each cell in a notebook as a kind of pseudo function, where just like any function, I need to return a value if I want something out of it, but I don't need to explicitly declare the arguments. Observable kind of does that for me and passes in all of the other cell names in my notebook as variables I can use. If my cell contains a simple expression, that's the return value. I don't need the explicit curlies and return keyword. Now, instead of returning, I can also yield values from inside a cell's code block, turning this into a generator from which Observable will automatically take the next value as soon as it's available. By default, Observable will update that value at most once per animation frame, up to 60 times a second. Now that's so fast that although I can kind of see those intermediary values here, in practice I'll only see the last yielded value as the value of my cell. Combined with a while loop, yield is super useful for creating things like animations in Observable. For example, if I write a little script looping through values from 0 to 1 and successively yielding each one, I can use that changing value to set the opacity of a HTML element to make that text, in this case, fade in and out. Okay, now that we've got some basic syntax out of the way, let's talk about one of the coolest things about the fact that Observable is powered by JavaScript. In my notebook, I can take advantage of the whole ecosystem of third-party JavaScript modules published on registries like NPM. I can use an external JavaScript module in my notebook with require. For example, many Observable notebooks use the D3 library for data visualization. I can require it and then use it as if it were a value in my notebook. Unfortunately, not every JavaScript module plays super nicely with Observable. So if you run into errors when trying to require the module you need, check out our module require debugger notebook to learn some tricks that might help you out. There are plenty more rabbit holes we could go down about how JavaScript works a little bit differently in Observable. So check out our notebooks Observable's Not JavaScript and Observable Anti-Patterns and Code Smells to learn more about that. Be sure to check out our other videos to learn more about how Observable notebooks work. And subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay tuned for more tips and techniques to help you write awesome notebooks.